Welcome to Humanifesto. This is the podcast that's rewriting the ADHD story one raw, real, and radically honest conversation at a time. I'm your host, Matt Jones, and today we're diving into one of the biggest identity shifts anyone with ADHD can go through: getting diagnosed as an adult. So if you've ever asked yourself, who was I before I knew I had ADHD? Or who the hell am I now? This episode's for you. We're going to explore what happens to our sense of self before, during, and after diagnosis, especially for those of us who weren't diagnosed until our 30s, 40s, or even later. I'll share some personal stories, real talk about grief and growth, and practical ways to start rebuilding your identity in a way that actually fits who you are, not who you've been pretending to be. And this is what I've really been looking forward to recording. This is me giving you what I wish I had when I got my diagnosis. So whether you've been diagnosed recently or not, if it came to you when you were young or when you were older, this one's for you. All right, let's get into it. Before my diagnosis, I thought I was just failing at life. I'd constantly miss deadlines, zone out mid-conversation, get overwhelmed by the tiniest tasks, and I'd blame it on laziness, lack of discipline, not being mature enough. And I was convinced that there was something wrong with me. I just didn't know what. And I know I'm not alone in that. Research by Dr. Russell Barkley, one of the leading experts in ADHD, shows that people with undiagnosed ADHD often struggle with executive dysfunction. Now that's just a fancy way of saying our brains have a harder time with planning, prioritizing, and getting stuff done. One of the most interesting and useful things I heard from him was when he talked about the split we have in our brains. ADHD is not a disorder of knowing what to do, it's a disorder of doing what you know. So what this means is that most of us with ADHD, we don't have a knowledge deficit. We usually know what needs to be done, how to do it, and oftentimes we even know why it matters. But in real time, especially when there's no immediate reward, structure, or external accountability, we struggle to translate that knowing into action. This is sometimes called intention-action disconnect. Performance inconsistency, not knowledge inconsistency. It's a problem with execution, not with intelligence. Now, the way Dr. Barkley frames it is that ADHD is a disorder of executive function, and executive function is about self-regulation over time to meet goals. He describes it as a breakdown in the future-directed mind, the part of the brain, primarily the prefrontal cortex, that allows us to hold goals in mind and act toward them even when it's hard or unrewarding in the moment. Those of us with ADHD can often do something when we're supervised, excited, interested, or under pressure, because these contexts provide that external structure. The difficulty lies in situations where we need to self-generate motivation, structure, or urgency, which is where executive function has to take over. Now, Dr. Barkley lists 5 elements of executive function that are all affected by ADHD. He talks about these 5 core areas underpinning our ability to be able to act on what we know. So the first one is working memory, which is the ability to hold information in mind to guide our actions. So I always think of it like this. You know when you see those fruit machines or the gambling machines in the pubs? Each of those slots is a piece of information that we're able to hold in our head and work with at the same time. Now, I've heard people talk about, for neurotypicals, they can usually hold between 5 and 7 pieces of information in their head at one time. Whereas for ADHDers, we can hold 2, maybe 3 bits of information in our head. Now, imagine how this affects our ability to be able to guide our actions. So let's look at this example. Imagine you're booking a holiday. There's lots of things you've got to think about, right? You're thinking about when you're going to go, how long you're going to go for, where you're going to go, what type of holiday, beach or pool or sightseeing, etc. You're thinking about your budget. You're thinking about what you need to pack, what the weather's going to be like. I mean, if you've been counting, we're already up to 7. And what that means is a neurotypical person can probably hold all these bits of information in their head simultaneously. Whereas for us, it's far more challenging because when we get to piece of information number 4, we've already forgotten number 1. And when we get to piece of information number 5, now we've forgotten number 2. Now, fortunately, I was able to book a holiday recently, and it was a nightmare. I would go on to the website that I was looking for or looking at, and each time I would put a search in, I'd put in a bunch of filters, and then as I started looking at the options, I couldn't remember which filters I picked. And then I'd go back into the filters, and then I'd check them, and then I'd come back out again, and then I'd forget some of them again. And I was back and forth, back and forth. And if it was anything like this for you, you probably had this experience where you end up with multiple tabs open, and I'm having to write notes down on paper. So I've got some way of trying to externalize all these bits of information in a place where I can see them because it's difficult for me to do it in my head. Think about it like when you're trying to do maths. If you've got ADHD, you probably find it much easier to write the problem out and do it on paper than to try and do it in your brain. Another example he gives is self-regulation of emotion. Being able to manage things like frustration, boredom, or stress. Now, for people with ADHD, we've got a really low tolerance for things like frustration and boredom. So our brains naturally try and pull us away from whatever it is that's causing the frustration or the boredom and go on to something else that feels easier or more comfortable. So that makes it difficult for us to stick with things and do things over a long period of time. That's why techniques like the Pomodoro technique are really useful, where we do things in short bursts with mini breaks in between to break that up so that the frustration, boredom, or stress doesn't get to a really high level, because before it gets there, we're already pausing for a 5-minute break in between periods of action. He also talks about a third one, internal speech, using our inner voice to guide, plan, or self-motivate. Now, I don't know if this is just me, because I have heard Rox on ADHD Love certainly mentioned this in a video I saw of her talking on Instagram about having multiple voices in our head. So I'm really interested if you have this too, because I remember a while ago before I got diagnosed, a family member is the doctor and was able to put me in touch with somebody who just moved from Spain over to the UK to start a research position in Cambridge University. So he said, she's not able to diagnose you because her license isn't valid in the UK yet, but she's happy to have a conversation with you. We were just having a chat, and we talked for about 2-3 hours in the end. And at one point, she was asking me about how things are like for me internally when I'm dealing with a stressful situation. And she asked me to give her an example. So I gave her an example from work and about how I just come out of a really difficult meeting and I had loads of other things to do and people were trying to grab me. Oh, Matt, have you got 5 minutes? Because I just come out of the meeting and people had questions and queries they needed me for. And I had so much going on in my head. And I remember describing to this lady that at that point, all the voices started taking over and it just got so loud in my head. And as I said that, she kind of paused, tilted her head to the side with a bit of a smile, and she looked at me and she said, "What do you mean when you say all the voices?" And I said to her, well, all those different voices you hear in your head, like you've got the one that sounds like you and the one that you're in control of, so that when you're sort of thinking, that's the voice you hear in your head. But then there's all the other voices as well that you don't have control over. You know what I mean? And she just sort of sat there with this smile and went, "No, I don't know what you mean." And I said, well, that happens for other people, right? They hear all these different voices in their head, and she's just shaking her head slowly like, no, other people don't have that. So she asked me to talk about it a little more. And what she sort of deduced was that actually, this is the part of the ADHD brain that's just high level functioning, right? I remember describing this to somebody who I work with as well. And we were talking about how when I'm in a good place, I'm in a positive mood, good energy, etc. I'm sleeping well, diet is in a good place and so on. Stress levels are under control. It's like I've got a group of people in my head. So when I'm in a meeting and somebody says, oh, we've got this problem, I don't know, morale's not great in the office at the moment, we need to do something about it. What I learned through this conversation with this doctor is that a neurotypical brain will deal with that in a linear fashion. So imagine like a piece of paper, and in the center, you've written down what the problem is. And then as you mind map it, what a neurotypical person does in their head, from what I understand, is they will try one avenue. So they'll think, oh, maybe it's because of the environment. Maybe it's because the air conditioning is always too cold, or maybe it's, blah, blah, blah. And they'll go through the environmental part of it, and either they'll think that that's the answer, or maybe it's not. If it's not, they come back to the middle, and then they think, oh, wow, actually, we've been really busy lately, so maybe it's workloads, and then they go down that track, and then they work out or imagine all the different elements of workload that could be impacting people. What I hear in my head is I hear a group of people talking about all the different things that are happening, and I literally see like a mind map just start appearing in my head. And this all happens in like fractions of seconds. So it means that I get to the point where I've already arrived at the answer, while the rest of the neurotypicals sitting around the table are only on their second or their third line. And I'm ready to move the conversation on, and I'm getting frustrated that they're not keeping up. And they're getting frustrated with me because when I'm explaining what I think we should do, they're asking me to talk them through how I've arrived at that decision. And it's difficult for me to do because I haven't mapped it out step by step. It's all just sort of appeared more or less at once. And what I've found is that it's really important for me to be able to manage my emotions because while I'm in a good place, those voices are really helpful. When I'm not in a good place, those voices are all telling me the negative stuff, how I'm a terrible manager, husband, partner, how that's a stupid idea, how nobody's going to listen to me, how I'm a loser. Do you know what I mean? And all these voices start literally mocking and poking at me and getting at me. So in order to get my brain working effectively in terms of this internal speech, the thing that's most important for me, and this may not be true for everybody with ADHD, but I need to make sure my emotions are in a good place in order for my brain to work effectively in that regard, because when I'm not, they don't. Now, the third thing Dr. Barkley talks about is what he calls reconstitution. So what he means by this is problem solving and flexibility in behavior. Now, with this one, we're generally pretty good problem solvers, but we're not so good at being flexible in our behavior. Yes, we're spontaneous. Yeah, we like to try new things. Yeah, we like to just sort of dive in, but we struggle when we have to change or adapt our behavior to fit a certain scenario or a certain situation. So the thing with this is it's about finding ways to recognize when we're starting to get uncomfortable, when we're finding it difficult in order to behave in a way that we think is appropriate for the situation that we're in. And I would encourage you to try and make a note of these in situations or environments to see what patterns that you notice, because this will be different for everyone. It's not something I can sit here and tell you this is the way to do it or this is the step-by-step plan to follow. So this is more of a trial and error thing. And then lastly, number 5 is inhibition. That ability to resist impulses or distractions, because when these are impaired, doing what we know becomes unreliable. And the inhibition thing, I think that's a really important one. I remember I was watching The Diary of a CEO when Trevor Noah was on with Steve, and he was talking about his experience with ADHD. And he was talking about this sort of constant inner monologue that he has, or dialogue that goes on in his head. And Steve was struggling to wrap his head around what that experience was like. So he gives him an example where he says, okay, so a little while ago, there was a car engine revving outside. Now, for a neurotypical person, what they would do is they would think, well, that car revving, I've heard it, so it's taken my attention for a second, but it's not relevant to this conversation I'm having, so I'm just going to ignore it and focus on the conversation in front of me. Now, you're probably feeling like I feel when you hear this, right? That is not how our brains work. Because the way Trevor described it was that once he's heard that car engine revving, the first thing he thought was, it sounds a little bit aggressive. Is maybe an accident about to happen or maybe just happened? What's caused that person to rev the engine like that? I wonder what kind of engine that is. I wonder what kind of car it is. What color would that car be? I wonder where they're going. And our brains are trying to figure out all these different questions at the same time. So the problem is with ADHD, this name, attention deficit, it's so far from the actual lived experience of what we deal with day to day. It's not that we have a deficit of attention. It's that we have so much attention that we find it difficult to know how to focus and where to put that attention. So I remember I was at a conference recently where we were sitting listening to somebody giving a speech, and you heard this sort of crash of plates and cutlery and stuff coming from the kitchen, which was in one of the adjacent rooms. Now, again, just like Trevor Noah, I'm thinking, how did that happen? Did somebody bump into that person? Was it an accident? Was that person not paying attention? Are they now getting in trouble with their boss? Does this mean lunch is going to be late? Is there going to be broken crockery and stuff in the food? And I had all these questions that made it impossible for me to focus on the person who's talking and what they're thinking about or what they're discussing, because all I can focus on in that moment is what that noise means. I've got all these open loops in my head that I'm trying to close off. So when it comes to inhibition, being able to resist these sorts of distractions can be really challenging, but it is something that you can get better at over time. So he also gives an analogy where he talks about ADHD not being a knowledge disorder, but a performance disorder. And he said, imagine knowing the rules of chess, but being unable to sit still long enough in order to make a move. But here's the important thing, folks. Instead of seeing this as a neurological issue, particularly before diagnosis, we internalize it and we turn it into a character defect or into shame. And it's not just us that do that. If your experience is anything like mine, I'm pretty sure it is, you've had teachers and parents and family and adults and other people in your life referring to your ADHD traits as problems of character. Now, in a 2019 study in the Journal of Attention Disorders, they found that adults diagnosed later in life often carry around emotional scars from years of not feeling good enough. And that really hit home to me, thinking about all the labels that I got growing up, that looking back now, I can see were just ADHD traits that weren't diagnosed at the time. But it got to a point where you've got to think, I wonder if what they're saying is right. So a 2019 study in the Journal of Attention Disorders found that adults diagnosed later in life can often carry around emotional scars from years of feeling not good enough because of these inappropriate labels that they were given when they were growing up. And that one really hit home for me. So take a moment and think about, what labels did you give yourself before you were diagnosed? Or what labels did other people give you? Lazy? Unmotivated? Messy? Emotional? And now ask yourself this question. Were those labels fair? Or were they just symptoms that you didn't have a name for yet? So now let's move on to the diagnosis and the identity earthquake that you probably experience. So when I got diagnosed, I was coming up to 41. And I remember sitting there, it was during the pandemic, and I was talking to the doctor virtually for my assessment. And when he said to me the words that he's comfortable to diagnose me with combined type ADHD, I felt two things at once. Like someone had finally turned the lights on and like the floor had just disappeared beneath me. It was like, on one hand, thank God, right? Like now I have an explanation. It isn't me. There's a reason for all of this, finally. But then on the other hand, it was sort of like, well, wait, what if I'd have known about this earlier? How different would my life have been? So yeah, there'll be relief, but there's likely also going to be grief. Attitude magazine calls it life regret syndrome. That experience of looking back on years of struggle and wondering what could have been different. And they're right. In the first few days after my diagnosis, I was flooded with a combination of positive emotions, things like relief, a feeling of validation, all these labels I'd been given. Well, not exactly given, more like forced on me, but labels that I'd had growing up. And I always felt like they were unjustified. And as a quick side note, if you've got ADHD, I know you have an intensely strong, visceral response to any form of injustice. And for me, the reason was deep down, I knew I wasn't lazy. I knew that I was trying so hard. And I also knew I wasn't someone who didn't care. I knew in my heart and in my soul, I cared more than pretty much anyone I knew or anyone I'd ever met. And I also knew I wasn't self-centered, trying to make everything about me. But when someone tells me a story of something they've experienced, and I share a similar story from my own life, it's not to turn the spotlight on me, but it's a way of me connecting. It's a way of me communicating to them, hey, I see you, I get you. I've experienced something similar, and I want you to know that I get it, so I'm trying to demonstrate and prove that to you by sharing this story. And that strong sense of injustice that I mentioned, it probably doesn't come as a surprise that this is due in large part to this very experience. We know all too well what it feels like to be misunderstood, judged and criticized unfairly. So it's only logical that when we see injustice in the world, it triggers us and it motivates us to want to stand up for the person on the receiving end. But after all the positive feelings started to run out, I was hit by this tidal wave of negative emotions. You name it: pain, grief, sadness, hopelessness, and this palpable feeling of unfairness. I started thinking about how my life would have been different if someone had only noticed this earlier in my life. How different would school have been? How much better would I have done in my classes with the right support? How much better would my grades have been? And to be fair, they were already pretty good, but how much better could they have been? And if they were, how would my options have been different for things like further education, for my career? And honestly, I was really pissed off. I felt like the system, the people in my life, and the world itself had massively let me down. It was like I was left-handed, and the world had demanded and forced me to do everything with my right hand while assessing, perceiving, and judging me like I was using my dominant hand and not taking the reality into account. I often use this metaphor when I'm trying to explain ADHD to neurotypicals, because think about it. Most people in the world are right-handed, so the world is primarily designed for right-handers. Think about which side the mouse is usually on the computer in most office or school setups. It's on the right. Where's the centre to swipe your entry pass as you go into a building, or your payment when you're going into the tube? It's on the right. Most scissors are comfortable in your right hand and feel awkward in your left. So really, ADHDers just have left-handed brains in a world designed for right-handed brains. And the grief continued for weeks, maybe even months. I grieved the jobs I quit too early, the relationships I sabotaged, the confidence I never got to build because I thought, well, no, not thought, I believed I was just broken. I don't know about you, but my experience with the labels was denial at first. Because I knew what I felt, how I thought, and what was going on internally, even if I couldn't explain it to other people or myself for that matter, or didn't have a name or a label for it. But eventually, I got to a point where I thought, okay, which is more likely? Everyone in my life is wrong and I'm right, or everyone else is right and I'm wrong? And I'm sad to say that slowly but surely, I started to give up and give in. I started to accept other people's views of me over my own. And looking back now, it was just taking the path of least resistance. Not because I truly thought they were right, but because I was tired. I was tired of explaining myself, tired of fighting with people when I had no data or evidence that backed up what I knew or felt to be true. Tired of the pain of being the only one in the room with this opinion. Tired of being looked at like I was just making excuses and trying to justify bad behavior or poor performance. But diagnosis also cracked open the door to something powerful. And that's the chance to rebuild, to figure out what was truly me and what was just survival mode. So take a moment to pause here, and I want you to think about how your diagnosis changed the way you look at your past. What memories feel different now that you understand your brain better? Does your perspective of those experiences shift now you have this knowledge and understanding about how your brain might be working differently to other people around you? And most importantly, now you're looking back through new eyes or through a new lens, how does that change the way you see and feel about your future? So let's talk about rebuilding. It's all well and good to know how things arrived at this point, but now you've got a diagnosis, who are you now? So post-diagnosis is not just about understanding your brain. It's literally about rewriting your entire self-story. All these things that you think about yourself, all these definitions that you've given or accepted about yourself, you need to start shape-shifting them. And I know that feels daunting, rewriting your entire life story, but actually, it's not as daunting as it seems. So stay with me here, okay? Because here's what I realized. A lot of what I thought were character flaws were actually ADHD traits. It wasn't that I was distracted. I'm curious. It wasn't that I was hyper. I'm passionate. And it wasn't that I was impulsive. I'm bold. I wasn't lazy. I was overwhelmed and exhausted from trying to work like everyone else. So Let's try and do a little bit of reframing. We touched on this a little bit on the last episode, but I'm going to go through a few ADHD quote unquote flaws and talk you through how we can reframe them to actually look at them as being more like strengths. So, distractibility. I'm sure you've heard that one quite a lot. Distractible, unable to focus. But actually, it's that we're incredibly observant and curious. Think back to that Trevor Noah example I was talking about a little while ago, right? Other people, i.e. neurotypical people, their brains filter out a lot about what's going on around them. But our brains pick up on everything and we take it all in. So it can turn into sort of sensory overload. But we'll couple that with our natural curiosity. And that's why it's difficult for us to keep our focus on the thing we should be thinking about when our brain is desperate to go off in a million and one other directions for all these other things that are happening. But it also means we see things that other people miss, and we figure out things that other people don't because of the fact that we're constantly assessing, constantly analyzing. You know, I gave the example once to somebody, I don't know if you've ever seen the Terminator movie, but you know how like when you see it goes into sort of Arnie's character's brain and he's scanning the environment and it's taking everything in and assessing everything? That's kind of how my brain feels on the inside. Don't get me wrong, I'm not a Terminator, but that's how my brain feels like it works. Another flaw that we apparently have is that we're hyperactive. But actually, you could reframe that to be that we're just energetic and enthusiastic. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I'm pretty sure a lot of you can relate to this experience where you're at work or school or at a family event or whatever it may be, you're in a group setting and the mood is a little bit low. And you decide that now's the time to start perking everybody up, right? Let's get going and have some fun. And as you're showing that energy and enthusiasm, you notice that the people around you, their frowns start to go up into smiles. Their eyes start to get a little bit wider and brighter. And people start to laugh a little bit more. They start to relax. The shoulders drop because we can really and heavily and effectively influence the people around us. I remember once when I was a kid, we went on holiday with my parents and my grandparents to Spain, I think it was. And we had just come back. We'd been out for dinner one night, and everybody was feeling a little bit tired. We'd been to the beach during the day, so we'd done a lot of walking and everything, and everyone was feeling a little bit sluggish. But when we got back to the villa, I wanted to have some fun. I wanted to put the music on and have a bit of a party, but no one else really seemed up for it. So I decided to force the issue. While they were all sitting outside having that quote unquote last drink before everyone goes to bed, I went inside, went up to my room, changed into my swimming shorts, came downstairs and I stood just outside the living room door, made sure that everybody was outside by peeking round the door frame, and then, as I sprinted through the living room, out onto the patio, I shouted, "Tonight's the night for a midnight swim," and dived straight into the pool with a big bomb and splashed everybody. Now, I could have got in trouble for that. I was taking a risk, right? Everybody cracks up, and before you know it, 10 minutes later, everybody's in their swim stuff, and we're all in the pool. We've got music on, and we ended up staying up for another couple of hours and all had one of the best nights of the holiday. Now, the next one is, I'm sure a lot of us have all been called impulsive. And that's probably an example of being impulsive, to be fair. But another way of reframing impulsivity is that we can be decisive and we can be intuitive. We've got this amazing pattern recognition part of our brain that means that we can figure out things pretty quickly. But sometimes it makes it difficult for us to explain to other people how we've arrived at that decision. Hence, they label us impulsive. It's not that we haven't thought things through, it's that we think things through so quickly other people don't accept that we've been able to think it through properly in such a short amount of time. And that's where the impulsive label comes from. And I'm sure you've all had a long-standing relationship with procrastination. One of my best friends, we spend time together most days. And to be honest, yeah, procrastination can be a challenge. But the reason why we do that, if you're not already aware of this, is because like Dr. Barkley was talking about with needing external reward structures and so on in place and consequences, the problem for us is that when we have a piece of work to do and there's no immediate consequences for not doing it right now, it's difficult for us to motivate our brains to get started. task starting or task initiation can be a real challenge for those of us with ADHD. But what we also learned through school and our time growing up is that when we leave things till the last minute and that impending deadline is now looming over us, all of a sudden something shifts in our brain. We click into this focus mode, which I've since learned is hyperfocus. And then all of a sudden, we can smash out that essay that takes everybody else 3 or 4 weeks to do in fits and starts, and we get it done in 5 hours in one hit. So that becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. We leave things till the last minute. That helps us to focus. We get the work done in a short space of time. But that then tells us that the right thing to do is to continue leaving things till the last minute, because that's when we do our best work. And whilst that may be true to a degree, that's okay in the short term. But over the long term, over the months and the years, using procrastination as a strategy to get things done isn't the smartest play, because it means we go through this repeated cycle of high peaks of energy and low troughs of crashing. And over time, that really takes a toll on us, on our bodies, on our minds. And also, in school or in the workplace, it can have an impact on our reputation as well. Because again, neurotypical people seeing us leaving things till the last minute, it just seems like bad behavior, as opposed to us using a system in order to get the best out of our brains. So that's where you can sort of circumvent this a little bit by putting in your own deadlines, so that you've got something to work towards rather than just using the final deadline as being the pressure to get things done. And as I heard somebody talk about on Instagram the other day, they said that we're not procrastinators, we're last minute ninjas under pressure. Now, another quote unquote defect or flaw that we have is getting overwhelmed by details. But really, I would reframe that to say that we're big picture thinkers. Because our brains are so good at scanning our environment, we pick up on all the details, and oftentimes we're doing a lot of this intuitively as opposed to cognitively, which means we haven't consciously thought through all the details, but we've seen them all and we're making decisions and guiding our actions based on that. Because we tend to think more of the big picture, because we're able to piece all of these tidbits of information or data together, and we're able to see things from a much higher level. And I don't mean higher level as in more intelligent, I mean like more of a bird's eye view, and we're able to see a wider view or a wider picture than other people. I bet you've also been called forgetful as well, and sometimes we can be, particularly when working memory is involved. But another way of reframing this one is that we're able to be present, to be spontaneous, and to be adaptable, right? One thing I always get told by people is that I'm a good listener. And that seems strange and a little bit in contrast or in conflict with the known traits of ADHD. But it's because if I'm listening to somebody talking and I'm interested in what they're saying, or I care about the person, I'm able to sort of hyper focus on what they're talking about. So I'm able to be present in the moment. So sometimes, sure, we can get distracted, but also sometimes that forgetfulness can go right the other way and help us to be more present. So daydreamer. I bet you've all had this one a few times in your life. I had that loads going through school. Takes me back to thinking about history in high school with Mr. Brennan. And he was always telling me about how I'm always looking out the window, I'm always doodling, I'm paying attention to anything other than what he and the class are talking about, and I need to focus more. But actually, he couldn't have been more wrong. I was thinking about everything he was talking about. The problem was, I was also thinking about lots of other things too, but not different things, things related to what he was talking about. So I remember in one class, I was in year 8 at the time, and he was telling us about how during Henry VIII's time, they didn't have running water, so it meant that they didn't have working toilets. And he talked to us about how they would go to the bathroom, particularly number 2, and it got me thinking, I wonder how people smelt back then. And if they didn't have running water, that meant that they couldn't wash their clothes very easily. So what did their clothes smell like? How often did they wash them? And then what about when people were being romantic or intimate? Ugh, God, what would that have been like? So I was thinking about Henry VIII. I just wasn't thinking about dates and how many wives he had and what their names were and so on and so forth. So it wasn't that I wasn't paying attention, it's that I was paying too much attention in one way. But the daydreaming thing also means that we're imaginative problem solvers, because our minds like to wander. And something that I've learned since my diagnosis is to give myself time to actually do that. I mean, something I do every night before I go to bed is my wife normally says, right, it's time for bed, because she likes to go to bed a little bit earlier than me. But as soon as she does that, that's the time when I get maybe half hour where I'm still downstairs in the living room and I get to just let my mind wander. And I let it wander about what's happened during the day, about what I'm going to be doing tomorrow, or wherever it wants to go. And sometimes I'm thinking about practical stuff like that. Other times I'm thinking about space and the universe. Other times I'm thinking about all manner of different things, time travel, whatever. But the point being is that before I got diagnosed, I always thought that was a bad thing. And I tried to stop myself from doing that. But actually, remember what I was talking about in terms of the conference here in the crashing plates and stuff, or Trevor Noah here in the revving car outside? When we stop our brains from being able to follow those meandering paths, our brains feel that resistance. Not only does it take energy and effort to be able to do that, but it also causes our brain to start to get frustrated, and it starts to build up stress or cortisol in our brains. And that cortisol makes it more difficult for the neocortex to function effectively. So by curbing our daydreaming, it actually has more of a negative cumulative effect on our brains. Now, I'm not saying that we should just sit and daydream all the time, because of course, whether you're in school or work or whatever, there's sometimes where you've got things that you do need to focus on. But don't do that at the expense of never letting your mind wander, because it's amazing how many great ideas and solutions your brain will come up with, particularly if you have ADHD, when you allow it to do that. And then lastly, another one that we get in terms of a potential flaw is hyperfocus, right? People see us where we get stuck into something and we find it hard to tear ourselves away because we're so engrossed, so engaged with what it is that we're reading, doing, seeing, experiencing. But yes, sometimes that can be a problem if it's not managed effectively. But another way of reframing hyperfocus is that when we are engaged with something, we are intensely passionate. And that comes back to the interest-based nervous system. So we're not sort of motivated by doing the quote unquote right things or wrong things in a given situation. We're motivated and engaged by what we find interesting. So when you find things that you are interested in, let that be a little notification to yourself that maybe that's something you should be spending a little more time doing. Now, I'll give you one other quick personal example. So in my personal life, I always used to beat myself up for jumping between projects and hobbies and so on, never seeing things through to the end, never getting things through to full completion before that magpie in my brain was jumping onto the next shiny thing. And the number of times where I bought that new notebook that's going to change everything, or I bought all the equipment for this new hobby that's going to change my life, only for it to end up in a cupboard of junk months later. But now I've realized that I have this interest-based nervous system. It's one that responds differently to rewards and consequences. And what that means is that I, and likely most of you, are built for dynamic, fast-paced environments. We thrive where other people freeze. And honestly, this podcast is a great example I can give you of that. This is something that I haven't ditched after the initial enthusiasm wore off. And I've had challenges, believe me. I've had ups and downs, but I've never thought about quitting. And the question is, why not? Well, it's because this really matters to me. You matter to me. Going through my life as an undiagnosed ADHDer and the journey I went through in terms of diagnosis and treatment and stuff beyond, and ingratiating and integrating all of this new knowledge into my life, I know how difficult and challenging that has been. And I also know that throughout this entire journey, what I craved more than anything else was somebody to tell me that I wasn't broken. I wasn't too much, and that who I was okay and was enough. And to be honest, looking back on it now, I wasn't even looking for understanding. So another analogy I like to use when I'm trying to help ADHDers and other neurodiverse people make sense of the challenges that come with trying to explain our neurodiverse brains to neurotypical people. For me, it's like a woman explaining labor pains to a man, or a man trying to explain to a woman what it's like getting hit in the crown jewels with a football on a cold day. The reality is, there's only so much that each gender can truly understand about the other, And there's inevitably going to be some limits to that understanding due to a lack of first-hand experience for them to relate to about the other. So, knowing now that true understanding from neurotypicals in my family, friends, co-workers and so on is pretty unlikely to ever truly happen, all I really want is acceptance. When a woman tells a man they're having a really bad period pain this month, an intelligent and compassionate man is going to accept that they're telling the truth, not demand evidence to empirically prove their claim. And when I state to a neurotypical person I'm having a hard time staying organised, or I'm struggling with verbal instructions or sitting still for long meetings, I want them to trust me and just accept that I'm telling the truth. I mean, think about it. Can you imagine if the reaction to a woman talking about how bad her period pains are was somebody saying to them, oh, just focus on something else other than the pain, or it's your fault for not planning for this better and having what you needed on hand in terms of pain relief? That is not understanding, compassion, inclusion, or acceptance. That's just bullshit, plain and simple. So now I know that my strengths, weaknesses, pros and cons all make up the person I am. And the same is true for you too. Like so many things in life, the key is finding out who you are and what you want. Because when you do that, staying true to your authentic self becomes easier. Not easy, but easier. And it makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, honestly, how can you be true to yourself when you don't really know who you are? So give yourself two gifts: patience and time. There's no right or wrong way to discover your true self, and it's definitely not a straight line. It's like fitness. If you want to get fit, how do you do that? There's tons of ways. Team sports, go to the gym, dance class, whatever. There's not a right or wrong answer. But I promise you this, it's the most rewarding journey you will ever take. Because when you get there, or even while you're improving and making your way towards there, all the pieces of your life will start slotting into place. And the best surprise of all is you'll realize that so many of your things that you currently give yourself a hard time for will be some of the things you love most about yourself. All you need is a shift in your perspective. And as a quick side note, give those two gifts to the people in your life as well who don't understand what it's like to have ADHD. And after all, how could they? Although, shameless plug, the trusted person workbooks that accompany this podcast would be a great start, wink wink. But look, there are still going to be gaps that may never ever be filled. So where you can, try and focus on the effort they're making over the results. Because believe me when I tell you, if you have a neurotypical person in your life who's making an effort to understand things from your perspective, that really is amazing. And I'm not sure that we can ask for much more from people than that. So pause to reflect. What's one ADHD trait you used to see as a weakness that might actually be a superpower? And now I'm going to run through a few tools that could help you rebuild your identity. So let's get practical. How can you start reframing your self-image and embracing who you really are? So you've got things like therapy. So things like CBT, talk therapy, and so on. These things are going to help you to rewire that I'm not good enough narrative that you've got in your mind. Speaking of minds, mindfulness is also a great technique. So whether it's meditation, whether it's mindfulness drawing, like coloring books, mandalas and things like that, these things are going to help build self-awareness so you learn to respond rather than react. As I mentioned on another episode, when I started meditating, I had this idea in my mind of, some monk dressed in orange sitting on top of a mountain for hours and hours on end in total silence with a completely clear mind. But since I've started meditating, what I've realized is that is so far from the truth. You still get emotions bubbling up, you still get thoughts bubbling up, but because I've decided to stay sitting there, and I only do it for sort of 5 minutes, 7, 8 minutes, something like that at a time. But what I've learned over time is that as I have these thoughts and emotions bubbling up during my meditation, and I'm not going to do anything with them because I haven't finished my meditation session yet, what I'm learning is I don't have to immediately react or respond to that thought or that emotion. And over time, that helps to build up that muscle, so it makes it easier for you to be a little bit less impulsive and a little bit more controlled, so you're not just having an emotion and just reacting to it straight away. The second one is journaling for identity. Now, there's loads of different ways you can journal and loads of different approaches, and I'm not going to tell you one is better or worse than the other because, again, like we've been talking about, it's what's best fit for you. But what I would say is, in my own experience, the most effective approach I've had is when I'm not following a rigid format. I just open the page, pick up my pen, and release whatever's in my heart and my mind onto the paper. I sort of open the page and imagine my journal is asking me, "So, what's going on with you?" And I just let it come out in whatever order, manner, and language it wants to. I don't try and control it. I just try and release it so my brain and my heart can feel a bit lighter. As the saying goes, a problem shared is a problem halved. And sometimes I find answers, sometimes I don't. Sometimes I have epiphanies or insights, sometimes not. But for me, the key is to look at this over the long term. Because for me, it works in a very similar way to therapy and coaching. I don't always leave a session with the answers I need. And sometimes I walk away with more questions than when I walked in. But these become food for thought over the next week and things for me to ponder over. But as I look back over a period of weeks or months, I'm able to see that every session, just like every journal entry, is nudging me closer to where I want to go and the person that I want to be. So if you're interested in journaling or you already do it, here's a few prompts you can try. What would I tell my younger self now I understand that I have ADHD? What strengths do I have because of my ADHD? What does success look like for me, not someone else's version? And as another quick side note, something I found unbelievably helpful is using AI, or more specifically ChatGPT, to help with this. So I've set up a project specifically for this purpose. Now, if you're a regular user of ChatGPT or similar tools, you probably know this, but just in case you don't, when you set up a project, or even in a single prompt, you can instruct the AI to act as a certain persona or personas. So I've set up a wellness project where I've instructed it to act as a world-class psychologist, psychiatrist, ADHD coach, and behavioral scientist. Then each day, after I've written my journal entry, and I like to write it rather than type it because I find it flows easier for me, but again, that's just a personal thing. But after I've written out my entry, I then dictate it into my wellness project and have these 4 personas analyze what I've written. And I've got to be honest, the feedback is almost always insightful, and it gives me further exercises to explore, areas to go into more deeply, or activities to try, or even other questions to try and answer. But quick disclaimer here, I'm certainly not telling you that this will replace therapy with a person or a professional, or that it's better in any way, but just that I found it really helpful. And certainly for people without the means to be able to access a therapist or a coach, I think this can be a really useful tool. And another quick side note, or a side note to the side note, if you'd be interested in some helpful ChatGPT prompts or ways to set up specific projects or ways to use it to support you in your ADHD, let me know in the comments or email me, matt@humanifesto.co.uk, or tag me on socials. And if there's enough interest, I'll happily put that together for you. So we've talked about therapy and coaching. We've talked about journaling. So number 3 is build an ADHD-friendly environment. Visual cues are better than memory. So for example, think about things like post-it notes on your bathroom mirror or your fridge. Putting your journal out somewhere where you're going to see it. Putting your workout clothes next to the bed so it's the first thing you see when you wake up, or whatever it may be. And I got to be honest, this came from James Clear's Atomic Habits. Great book if you haven't read it. I really recommend that you do. But using visual cues in the environment I found super useful. Same thing with time blocking. Better than strict to-do lists, because depending on my mood, depending on how my day's going, I don't always want to go in a linear fashion and work my way through a to-do list. So what I do now is I time block, not just in terms of hours, but in terms of days. So I have certain days set aside in the week for recording and editing, others for more admin type tasks like building workbooks, responding to emails, and so on. And I found that keeping that sort of separation has really helped to reduce the cognitive load that comes from task switching, because that's another thing that we really struggle with. Another one, in terms of an ADHD-friendly environment, is building movement into your day. We're not good with rigidity. We're not good with sitting still for long periods of time. So make sure that you're taking time to be able to get up, move around, stand in desks, whatever it may be. I even find that once I've done something that's been particularly taxing on my mind, getting up and walking into a different room, even if it's just for a minute or two, and then walking back in, I just feel a bit more refreshed when I come back into the room, as opposed to staying in the room where that weight just seems to get heavier and heavier. But also, this is a personal thing for you guys. So play around with things like music and playlists, fidget toys, different smells and scents in the room, different types of lighting. You're looking for whatever is going to give your brain dopamine in healthy ways. And then lastly, find your people community, because that's going to change everything. Where you can, try and be open about your ADHD, because you never know who else in your life has it or understands it. And I've genuinely found that the more I speak openly about it, the more supportive people that I find. Not that the people in my life necessarily all become more supportive, but sometimes they do. But also sometimes I find new people who come into my life who are able to be more supportive than some of the people that are already there. Think about it like raising a flag. How are other ADHDers supposed to find you if you always keep it hidden away? All right, so time to wrap up. Let's bring it home. So if you're navigating life after an ADHD diagnosis, remember that you're not starting from scratch. You're meeting yourself, possibly for the first time. You're not broken, you're just wired differently. And now that you know the wiring, you can build something amazing with it. So your challenge this week, write a letter to your pre-diagnosed self, telling them what you've learned. Tell them what they most needed to hear, that they were never lazy, broken, there's nothing wrong with them. And they have a wealth of untapped, undiscovered talents just waiting to be leveraged. They just didn't have the right lens yet. Or alternatively, you can do this the other way around and write a letter from your pre-diagnosed self to the person you are today. Tell them what you're proud of them for, how the place they got to and the struggles they've overcome inspire you to keep going and not give up. And most importantly, keep this letter somewhere that you'll come across it in the next few months. Because just like with journal entries, when you go back and review them later on, it's amazing how you can see that your perspective has changed and you can get to see how much you've grown. Because all of this stuff is incremental and sometimes you don't realize how far you've come. And going back and reviewing journal entries or letters like this can really help put that into sharp focus. And also, I'd love to hear your stories, who you were before and who you are now. So please share your reflections via email or on socials. All the links will be in the show notes as usual. And if this episode resonated with you, subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who you think needs to hear it. And take some inspiration from Martin Luther King Jr. with you this week. Take the first step in faith. You don't have to see the whole staircase, just take the first step. So, until next time, remember, you're not starting over, you're coming home, to yourself. And I'll leave you with this one from Ralph Waldo Emerson. To be yourself in a world that is constantly trying to make you something else is the greatest accomplishment. Thanks for listening, everybody. Have a great week. Speak to you again soon for the next Humanifesto.